story later.
I will now call the special budget work session to order, and it is 7:26. Tonight's meeting is conducted both in person and online. Members of the public may attend in person or also online, or they can view this meeting at burnsvilleevent.gov/meetings or watch us on Comcast Channel 16 or 859. And the public can also participate through Zoom by joining us at zoom.us/join. And more information is available on our meeting webpage and in the council agenda packet. This evening is a special work session, and it is the proposed 2025 fees discussion. And City Manager Lindberg, do you want to make any remarks before I go to our Deputy City Manager, CFO?
Mayor, you can go right to Jenny.
Okay. Jenny Rhodey is our Deputy City Manager and Chief Financial Officer, and she is presenting, and she will introduce our consultant, who's been with us through all of this journey, so it's good to see Dan back. So, Jenny, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, council members. Tonight we're here to talk about the proposed fees for 2025. I'll do a little introduction, a review of the budget calendar. We'll review a couple of the other funds, and then I will turn it over to Dan, and he will go through the utility rate study, which impacts the stormwater and water and sewer funds. Just as a reminder, the budget calendar, remaining budget meetings on the calendar. Tonight, we're talking about the fees and utility rate study. Next week, next Tuesday on the 17th, we'll adopt the proposed city and EDA property tax levy. We do have a placeholder on November 26th at that work session to discuss the proposed budget if needed. And then finally, on December 5th, we will adopt the city and EDA property tax levy and budget and CIP. Tonight, we'll review fees. Attached to your background was the proposed fee schedule. Each year, the leadership team reviews fees in their areas. Some of those fees are set for us by statute, city agreements, or policy, or other agreements. So those are set in those manners. In that manner. Otherwise, discretionary fees were increased by about 3%. Our annual utility rate study informs those utility rates for stormwater, sanitary sewer, and water. And just in terms of the enterprise funds, we'll be reviewing the financial results or the financial projections for the enterprise funds tonight, and fees are the primary source of revenues in those funds. First, we'll start with the Ames Center. As we look at this overall, cash balance or fund balance is above the cash balance requirements in all 5 years of the plan. You can see that there is kind of a steady decline that really is spending down. We did get that SVOG funding a couple of years ago, so we did have a higher cash balance. They do fund capital replacements, capital equipment, those operating capital types of items from this fund. So those are included there, as well as there's an additional about $4 million in capital outlay or capital projects that are included in the facilities fund related to this facility. And that really, those types of improvements really are more of those building upgrades, building maintenance, those things that are really facility type improvements.
Could I hit one, Madam
Yeah.
Mayor, one question,
Yeah.
Ames Center related?
Yep.
When is the final year of our debt service payment?
I believe that's 2028.
Yeah,
28?
it's coming up.
So
Thank you.
the next fund is the ICE Center. As you can see, revenues and expenditures are staying pretty stable. Revenues generally are meeting expenses in terms of we're financing our operational needs. This fund also does fund some capital replacement, really those operational type replacements. Ice resurfacers and other things like that are funded out of this fund. As you can see, ending fund or cash balance requirements, we are above those cash balance requirements in terms of our ending fund balance is above what our targets are for all of the 5 years in this plan, and pretty steady, really just a pretty steady balances across the board. I believe there is approximately $2 million in capital funding included in the facilities fund that relate to more of the facility and building upkeep, maintenance, and those kinds of improvements there. So that is that's also included in the facilities fund. Golf course. This fund has a few years where the ending fund balance is below those cash balance requirements or targets. We did have larger capital items in 2024 and 2025, about $125,000 and $135,000 in those 2 years. Those are really, I believe, mowers, utility carts, utility vehicles, a golf cart. So in those first 2 years, you see we've drawn down that cash balance. It stays down about $40,000 to $50,000 for a couple of years, but it does start rebounding in 2027. And you can see in 2029, we expect that ending cash to be over our cash balance targets. So this also, if you were to pull out last year's, it's a very similar trajectory. And in fact, in 2028, we were just kind of at that same point in terms of our cash meeting those cash balance targets, which is that blue line is the target. So we are rebounding after a couple of years of staying low. We are budgeting to continue the rounds. The rounds went up after 2020, and our revenues went up in this fund, and we have sustained that increased revenue. So those plans are generally to plan for similar revenues into the future. The street lighting fund. The revenues in this fund are really street lighting fees, continuous street lighting fees, and major roadway street lighting fees. Those two also are billed through the monthly utility bills. We're proposing a 0% increase there. As you can see, our ending cash balances are well above our cash balance targets in this fund. So we'll definitely monitor those every year, but for the time being, we don't see a need for any rate increases in this fund. All right, with that, I'll turn over the utility rate study discussion to Dan, and he can continue with that.
Thank you so much.
Welcome, Dan. It's always good to see you.
It's nice to see you as well, Madam Mayor, members of the council. I learned earlier this evening that apparently there is an election in November, and some folks have encouraged me to go quickly so they can enjoy the debate. Others have encouraged me to go longer so they don't have to watch it. So I feel a little conflicted, but I'll do my best to keep all camps happy.
Who won that election?
So this evening, as the Deputy City Manager mentioned, we are discussing the utility rate study update for the City of Burnsville prepared by Ehlers. By way of introduction, my name is Dan Tinter. I'm a Municipal Advisor with Ehlers and Associates, and this evening we're going to walk through a few areas related to the 3 utility funds that are subject to the analysis. We'll talk a little bit about the goals of the study itself. We'll go through some assumptions and findings, capital project needs, and a few other areas by individual fund. As we have in the past, we'll talk about the ratepayer impact analysis as a result of the recommendations and the proposed changes in each of the utilities, and then we'll close with some next steps and some plans moving forward. So you may have seen some information like this in the past, either in the information provided by Ehlers, or it's very similar to what we also talk about during our discussions with the council about the financial management plan. But really with the utility funds, we really are trying to ensure that they remain self-sufficient. As a reminder for the group, these funds and as the Deputy City Manager mentioned, rely totally on the fees, rates, and charges that they charge annually. There are no property taxes associated with these funds, so we have to make sure that they remain self-sufficient, and those fees, rates, and charges are sized accordingly to meet all of their ongoing operational needs and, of course, any of the capital outlays that are included in the capital improvement plan. And as a result, we're really trying to maintain those appropriate fund and cash balances over a series of years to make sure that really, and the term we often use when it comes to utility funds is they have the targeted amount of working capital. And you'll see this a few times in the presentation about what those amounts are by the individual funds. But much like the fund balances you see in other funds, they really are to support the cash flow of the operations, any debt service payments that are required by the respective funds, any unforeseen repairs or maintenance or projects that may happen in the course of the year, any emergencies that the city and staff may have to respond to, and of course, any changes in the council's direction, feedback, or guidance or agreements you may enter into that could impact the funds. So we're trying to make sure that there's enough room to operate and there are financial resources available to support anything that can happen over the course of the year or by virtue of this projection over the course of 5 years. And really, as we go through the process, we try to balance debt, and we'll walk through the debt assumptions in a few slides here, and the use of cash for certain projects. So we really go kind of line by line through the CIP and try to identify projects that are good candidates for the use of bonds and projects that are good candidates for the use of cash. But then ultimately, we try to use all that information to structure your utility rates in a way that supports the funds and those goals. And really the North Star here to keep in mind is we are always, much like we do with the property tax levy, trying to aim for stable, predictable growth in the rates. We don't want to see things go up and then down and then up again and then down. We really want to make sure that people have a good understanding from a ratepayer perspective that year over year, there's predictable, stable change. And they can plan their lives and business operations around kind of that expectation accordingly. So a few assumptions, and this is always a bit of a preamble, but I always think it's important to disclose a few things when we go through the process because this is our best guess today. We're taking a snapshot in time, and we're using all the information we have to make our best decisions and draw our best inferences, but if you sat through a few of these presentations before, you know that my running joke is, if I'm sure of anything, is that it's wrong. We are doing our best to figure out what would happen, but really what we're trying to do is give the council, the staff, and really the greater community a sense of the order of magnitude. Are things generally moving in the right direction? Are there course corrections that have to happen if that's not the case in order to make that happen? It's really helpful then for the council to decide what are the long-term impacts of any financial decisions you might make with your capital projects, your operations, or potentially your rates. A few things that we do is we do target that minimum working capital requirement, and that really is 6 months of your operations. So making sure that you have a significant amount of money to cash flow the various needs of the operations. We do include some depreciation. Generally in the model, we use a 40-year depreciation schedule, and that really is a proxy to try to recapitalize the fund, to know that things degrade and wear and break down over time, just ordinary wear and tear, and there should be some amount of money that's put back in the fund in order to make provision for their replacement or repair or improvement. And then really we look at making sure that there's 1 year of debt service. So each of these funds, except for stormwater, has debt, and so we do try to size those cash balance requirements to make sure that you always have 1 year's worth of payments in the fund. So if there's ever a disruption in the services, if there's anything maybe a little odd that happens with its revenues or its cash flows, you do have enough money to make those debt service payments. And that's primarily to make sure you don't have to use any property taxes or other revenues in order to make your bond payments in normal order. As I always like to stress when we go through this process, we assume that all projects that are currently included in the CIP are funded and that all of those expenses occur in their appropriate years identified in the CIP. Put another way, we do not at Ellers make decisions about whether or not a project should happen and when it should happen. What we try to do is craft the revenue requirements that you need in order to deliver the strategic vision of the council and the recommendations of staff. Of course, if the council or staff is uncomfortable with those estimates based on what we're seeing, you can always make decisions. You could potentially borrow more money, raise the rates, lower the rates, perhaps change the order or reduce the number of capital projects. There's a number of levers that you can pull, but really we know generally what the CIP looks like, and so we try to size that accordingly. We'll go through some flat and monthly rates, kind of slide by slide and utility by utility. Other revenue growth, we look at kind of 2 to 4% depending on the area. Investment earnings, we target 2%. It can be more, it can be less, but we tend to treat that line item kind of as gravy. If it's more, it simply falls to your cash balances and you have some more money in future years to do projects. And then expenses for operations, it's 2 to 3.6%. That 3.6% is a little on the higher side, and that's for the MCES charge, which, as the council is aware, you have very little control over. You just are given a bill every year by the Metropolitan Council to treat your wastewater. And then expenses, we have a 0%, and that might be a little unusual, but that's because staff actually inflates the projects in these areas, so we don't inflate them on top of it, so we're not double inflating things. A few other things, the funds are designed to meet all of your operating needs, so we're making some historic personnel allocations among the funds. So an individual position may have a certain portion of it paid for by the property tax levy, paid for by the water utility, paid for by the sanitary sewer utility, or the stormwater utility. So we make some approximations for that. And then right now we know from the organizational analysis that between 2023 and 2025, there's an additional 4 FTEs, 2 of which are really programmed for the water fund, and the other 2 are apportioned across those various funds. We also know that this city has requested about $8.55 million in state bonding to support certain water utility projects. And since we're working between 2025 and 2029, based on feedback that we've received from the city, we have recognized about $3.6 million of that request in that 5 years. In the following 5 years, that's where the remaining $5 million is currently planned. And I'll talk about this in a few more slides, but we are assuming with those requests that there is a 50% local contribution. And there's some rationale behind that, and I won't get into it right now because we have a slide and a few slides to talk about it. And as we know, there's always plans, studies, things that you're talking about, items and projects that are under consideration. So we know that in May, the council will receive the water treatment plant condition assessment, and that's reflected in the CIP. But we also know there's a number of other pending studies that can really have a significant impact on the capital activity, potentially the staffing, and then of course, as I mentioned, because everything's funded by rates, eventually the rates. And right now, the 3 that really spring to mind are that horizontal infrastructure study, the fleet studies, and then of course the pavement management plan, because there are portions of these funds that do support your pavement management activities. So not to bury the lead, we can just start out with some general findings. Really, first is the Water and Sanitary Sewer Fund. As you know, this is a combined fund. And so really from a financial presentation perspective, it's one fund, but we do break it out between the 2 utilities for the purposes of the presentation and the analysis. The water utility is generally performing well. The sanitary sewer utility, and we'll talk about this in a little more detail, is having some challenges. It does require additional cash, both in current and future years, and we have some graphics to outline kind of what that looks like. And we do have some preliminary questions about some of the usage patterns and really the revenue generation. Right now, it doesn't appear that in our model that this particular portion of the fund is really meeting those projections. And that's really a long way of saying that there's going to be some additional analysis that has to be done in this area. And staff has already requested that Ellers work through what is really more of a rate structure analysis that will be presented to the council before the end of the year. So one of the virtues of this process is we identify things well in advance before they become a major issue, and we have the opportunity to make a course correction. But this is one of the areas where a little additional analysis and discussion will be needed, and what exactly that looks like we'll touch on in a couple of slides. Stormwater Utility Fund also performing well, probably performing the best among the funds. It perhaps has the simplest story to tell, and so we'll talk about that. And there's really some other things to think about as we go through. You know, this is a term of art. We've kind of described the impacts as being moderate. They're not zero, but we don't generally consider them, to use a technical term, to be huge. There's some impact, so we kind of think of it as moderate. There will be increases in each of the funds, and of course, as a result, residential and commercial payers will have to pay a little more than they paid last year if their usage was exactly the same. We do limit debt to those larger capital projects, so we're making sure that really the things that are smaller, perhaps things that are deferred maintenance, repairs, smaller equipment, you're paying for those in cash. And really the larger capital projects, we're using debt. And then we do know it's that capital project pressure that's really, really tending us towards rate increases in the models. So when we look out over the next 5 years, if you were to add up that blue total line, there is about $52.1 million in total capital projects spread across the 3 utilities. Really, when you look at them individually, and And we try to look at this and compare them to the previous iteration of the model, which was last year. Over that 5-year period, you're spending about $4 million less in the water fund. But the reason for that is we have, on the advice of staff, moved around some of those state bonding requests, and some of them are beyond the 5-year period. So there's $5 million of state bonding requests that have been pushed out a few more years, and they're not captured in these numbers. And actually, if you were to control for that, the overall size of the CIP over these next 5 years is about $1 million larger. So it's a little confusing just because we have some moving parts with the state bonding, and the state bonding is a significant amount of money. And it's just something to keep in mind when we're trying to, it makes it more difficult to compare kind of apples to apples over years. But generally, it's similarly sized in terms of the overall cost for the water utility, but it is more, about $1 million. Sewer is also a little more, about 1.5 million compared to the previous model, so that is an increase of about 22%. And then really stormwater has had some shifts. This is less than what we've seen last year, but if we actually stretch out the trajectory over a 10-year period, we are seeing that compared to what was prepared last year, it was about $31 million, and this year it's about $29 million. So over a 10-year period, it's about the same activity, maybe less than these immediate 5 years, just because of how some of the projects may have changed over time. And also understanding that there are these major studies that are currently underway. Some of these projects have perhaps been moved out, waiting for that additional analysis before the city decides to commit to them in the immediate planning window. So when it comes to the bonding, right now we are estimating just over $28 million in bonding over the next 5 years. These are fairly typical amounts of what we've seen over the previous iterations of the model and what the city has bonded for historically in each of these funds. Really, when we compare to last year, we were estimating about $25.7 million for water. That's come down a little bit, again, because of some of the shuffling of projects. But sanitary sewer is up about 1.5 million. So in total across all the funds compared to last year's model, you're borrowing about under the recommendations about $2.6 million less in total. So again, given the overall size of the projects, the size of the CIP, the time span that we're looking at, the 5 and potentially 10 years, it's not a significant amount of movement. It's not to say that $2.65 million isn't real money, but when we start to look at the overall size of the capital activity of the city, it's not what we would generally consider to be a significant shift. The other thing to keep in mind when you're looking at that little asterisk, it says we've assumed a 50% match for the state bond requests. And that's primarily because although the city over the next 10 years is planning to request somewhere around $8.55 million from the state, we generally know that the state, oftentimes with state bond proceeds, will ask for some type of local contribution. And 50% is not an uncommon number. And so generally when we put together these models, we like to be conservative in terms of what we're expecting the capital pressure on the funds to be. So by modeling it at 50%, really what ends up happening is if the state is more generous with the city, then that is less money that the city would have to borrow and potentially rates could come down, or that borrowing capacity could be dedicated to other projects. If the state is less generous, but you still happen to win some state bond proceeds, you would have to borrow a little more, but then potentially the impact on rates would not be as great. So what we've done is essentially targeted the middle of the road, understanding that if there's variability that occurs in those state bonding allocations, the movement for the city and the pressure on the fund overall tends to be less. You're kind of halfway there, depending on which way you look at it, and then you can size accordingly. If you're more successful, that's great. If you're less successful, you're in a position to respond to that. So we look at the water utility, as you can see kind of the top in the kind of light pink salmon color. We're currently recommending a 5% increase in the rates. Really, this is because of those capital costs that I mentioned before. And really, when we are looking at the rates tend to be somewhat reverse engineered. We look at the operating needs, we look at the capital needs and the debt service, and then we also consider what revenue is being generated and then what we think that working capital target ought to be. And then we arrive at what the revenue should be adjusted by in order to meet all of those moving parts. And so we'll talk about this in just a slide, and you can see how it impacts some of the working capital requirements. But really, to that second bullet point, we're trying to maintain those cash reserves for those capital needs and debt service, and to make sure you have the cash flow. And of course, as I mentioned, to use a term of financial art, there's some impact to the average ratepayer. When you look really at those lowest flat rates, we're at about a 49-cent increase between the 2 years at 5%, and when you look at the lowest residential and multifamily tiers, it's about a 12-cent increase. So some impact, but ultimately the fund and the rates, or this portion of the fund, I should say, and the rates responding well to the cost pressures. To put it in perspective, the last year's model had this funding, the rates for this fund increasing by about 3.75%. So it's a little more, not significantly more than what was recommended last year, but again, responding to those capital pressures, those operating needs that we're seeing, and really, as I mentioned, that North Star, maintaining the financial position of the fund so the city has the maximum flexibility.
Dan, just
Yeah.
to point out, this isn't something that it's all cost recovery, it's a pass-through. It's what our
Yeah.
water utility costs to provide water to the city. As those costs rise, the rates are passed on to the users.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
The fund relies totally on the fees that it generates.
Yeah.
Madam
so-
Mayor, members of the council, I think one other important reminder here, we've done quite a bit of discussion of this over the course of the past year, but an important reminder, particularly for the community, to Councilmember Keeley's question. We completed a very comprehensive assessment of our water treatment plant,
Yep.
and not only did that inform the state bonding requests that
Yep.
that we've made, we continue to pursue, but these rates reflect our investment in those critical infrastructure items that were identified through that study. So said another way, these increases take care of the long-term delivery needs, water system needs that we currently have.
Additionally, and as I've joked with the deputy city manager before, and to the city manager's point, ultimately, civilization stops running when the water stops running. So at this point in time, these rates are designed to support what is really critical infrastructure for, of course, the residents of the city, but then also any of the going concerns.
Well, and that's the largest healthcare spend that any governmental entity makes is water treatment. Like, that is a healthcare expense.
Yeah.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, yes, that's correct. Obviously, clean, potable water is certainly a public health issue and concern. So when we look at the projections, as I mentioned, really the cash balances continue to remain stable, and they are above the working capital requirements. Part of the reason I mentioned that we tend to reverse engineer this a bit when we look at those capital requirements versus what we are seeing in the fund for those cash balances. You can see in 2028, the fund is actually slightly below the working capital requirement, and generally that is not an issue. It's okay if you dip below it, especially your capital spending tends to be episodic. It's a little lumpy. There may be series of years where you're savings, a few years where you're spending, but really what we want to see is that, is there stability? Is the fund trending in the right direction? And then if you dip below that working capital requirement, is there a plan to get you at or above it in the near future? And so as you can see here, in the year immediately after, in 2029, the fund then returns to being above that working capital requirement. And so when we recommend the 5%, we look at some of these factors and try to figure out, well, how do we get you on the glide path that you need to be on in order to be above that working capital requirement at the end of the projection period? But over that time, even with those rate increases, the city would be funding almost $30 million in capital projects over those 5 years, and it'd be supported by almost $22 million in bonding. And that bonding is a critical consideration because that is really something, much like you do with the property tax rate, it's something that the city can do to provide that stable, predictable change in the rates over time. If you were to increase the rates to pay cash for everything, the rates would have to go up quite a bit in order you to have that much money on hand. The borrowing lets you deliver those large critical infrastructure projects that were mentioned easier, while also spreading out the cost over a series of years and then keeping the rates more stable and predictable. The other thing to keep in mind about bonding that I always like to mention is that one of the virtues of bonding is that you are spreading out the payments into the future, meaning that people that move into the community into the future and then enjoy the investment that the city has made in this infrastructure are now also helping to pay for it. If you pay cash, you're using money that everybody that used to live in the
Yeah.
community helped you accrue. So there is something of a philosophical distinction to bonding in that way. And while it's not always the most important factor in the decision-making, I think it's something to point out that you are spreading that cost into the future, and people that are enjoying that then have the opportunity to pay for it. So when we look at the sanitary sewer utility, as I mentioned in the kind of lead, that this is the fund that is a little more challenged. There are concerns about the usage and the revenue trends. From our modeling, it seems that the fund is underperforming its revenue expectations, and it's also underperforming some of its usage expectations. And so there needs to be a bit of additional analysis in this area to kind of figure out exactly what's happening and why. And as I mentioned, staff has already spoken with Ellers about preparing that kind of what we've kind of called phase 2 of the utility rate study update, where we're going to take a longer look at the rate structure and perhaps why some of these dynamics are happening. But you can see it play out in a slide here when we look at the ending cash numbers that are happening in the fund and why the city may have to take a look at, as you see here, increasing the rates for this fund about 9.5% for next year, and actually 9.5% the year after, and 9.5% the year after that. So really a trio of 9.5s over the next 3 years. It's worth noting that last year, the recommendation from Ellers was 3 consecutive years of 7%. And so the fund has been under this pressure for a few years now. Some of the capital costs have increased, as I have mentioned, that one additional 1.5 million, and the fund has a little less cash in it because of some of the preliminary questions we have about the revenue projections and the usage considerations. And so when we look at having kind of a little less cash, having a little more project, and then already being at 7% last year, really if we just continue that into the future, we need more money immediately, and that ends up turning into that 9.5%. So really put simply, it was, and this math isn't perfect because I'm not doing the compounding, but it was 21% over 3 years last year. It's more like 28.5% over 3 years this year. And that's because of that cash question and then those additional capital projects.
Are the Met Council rates also increasing?
Madam Mayor, members of the council, yes, the rates do not go down. The Met Council has had the long-stated goal of trying to provide what the city attempts to do in its own rates, that stable, predictable growth at 2%, but over so many years, they just have not been able to achieve that. And so generally, when we look at the rates, we do see them going up kind of more than usual. The one thing to keep in mind here, and I think to what you're alluding to, Madam Mayor, is that when it comes to the sanitary sewer utility portion of the fund, about 60% of your operations is the MCES charge.
Yeah.
And so if the Met Council delivers a larger than expected rate increase to treat your wastewater, really the only thing that you can do, to Councilmember Keeley's point, is pass that cost along
Yeah.
to
the
the people that are
ratepayers.
using the sanitary sewer utility in order to make the payment to the regional system to treat the wastewater. And so in this area, you have really less self-determination for a good portion of your operations. Now, there are things you can do, like I&I projects, to try to get down the amount of stormwater that leaches into the sanitary sewer system, because then you're just treating rainwater. And the Met Council does provide grants for that. It also encourages the city to spend its own money on some of these projects. And it really is a situation where you have to spend money to make money, because your rates are predicated on your proportionate amount of the regional flow to the system. And if some of that regional flow is infiltration into the sanitary sewer system from stormwater, you're paying to treat that. And so that's where there's a balancing act here about spending money on sanitary sewer projects, spending money on stormwater projects in order to realize some kind of investment in the future to protect yourself from potentially larger than usual rate increases from the Met Council. But
Yeah.
since it's a regional system, you can only control so much of that, because obviously they're making decisions that are best for their entire service area, not necessarily for an individual city or a component unit that they're servicing. But right now, if we look at the 9.5%, if you look at the flat rates for all water users, that's really about 67 cents is about what it goes up right about now. But as I mentioned, it's designed to really build those cash reserves over time and help the city pursue those additional capital projects. So right now, here's the projection for the fund. As you can see, the orange, that is the target working capital. And right now, even with those 9.5% increases in 25, 26, and 27, and 3% thereafter, the fund is still about $1.8 million below the target working capital at the end of 2029. And in fact, if we just play out the trajectory of the fund using some assumptions, we can see that the cash balance actually remains below the working capital requirement until about 2032. Now, that's a good and bad thing. It's good because you are on a glide path and a trajectory to get back above the working capital requirement, but at the end of the 5-year period, you're still below the working capital requirement. So what that means is you have less flexibility, less room to maneuver, maybe a less of an opportunity to absorb certain unforeseen costs. There's less flexibility for the council potentially to add projects because you would have to still deliver some of the mission critical infrastructure improvements. And so it's just something to keep in mind, and it's also part and parcel of why the recommendation to increase the rates by nearly 10% is what it is. But really, ultimately, I think the thing to keep in mind here is that even with these rate increases, even with the fund, this portion of the fund kind of being in a more challenged cash position, you're still going to deliver the better part of $9 million in capital projects over 5 years. But again, much like the water fund, and to provide stability in rates, you're still going to be bonding about $6.6 million. So something to keep in mind there. If Jared was here, I would say, as my lawyer friends say, a lot of ins, a lot of outs. Some of the ins you can't control, like the MCES charges, but really you have an opportunity over time to rebuild the fund. And we'll do some additional analysis here over the next couple of months to figure out if these rates might change a little bit. But generally, from a cash flow perspective, we're at the 9.5%. So the Stormwater Fund, as I mentioned at the top, this is perhaps the simplest story to tell. There are no changes to rate increases since the last update. We're still at 2.5%. And if you're doing the math at home, that's about 19 cents more between 2024 and 2025. Really, the fund has sufficient reserves in order to absorb certain costs. And at this point in time, there really is a minimal impact on the ratepayer. So really, this is more of an inflationary adjustment just to make sure that the revenues that are flowing to the fund are generally keeping up with inflation. But what we do see is that the cash balances at this point in time, given the stormwater needs that have been identified in the capital plan, do tend to generally decrease over the planning period. But as you can see, much like we talked about earlier with street lighting, it still remains well above the working capital requirement. But it is worth noting that it is decreasing over time, meaning that the spend out of the fund is greater than the revenues that are being received by it. So at some point in time in the future, if the fund starts to dip or get closer to that working capital requirement, the city may have to consider larger increases. It has not, as mentioned in the last bullet point on this slide, traditionally bonded for projects in this fund, but you do have that option. So you could bond for projects in the future in order to protect the cash balances. Or, of course, you could always modify the CIP to reduce the capital projects or change their order or structure in order to protect the financial position of the fund. But ultimately, right now, you would still be well above the working capital requirement at the end of 2029 while still spending almost $14 million in capital projects. So ultimately, it's in a good financial position. There is perhaps one little asterisk just to say to monitor it over time, just to make sure you don't get too close to that working capital requirement. But ultimately, this fund is in a strong position. So when we look at the monthly bills, all of that really adds up to what we've termed as a moderate impact on the median users. When you look at a typical residential property using about 4,000 gallons per month, their monthly bill on average would go from about just under $53 to just over $56, or about $3.55 more per month, or really about $42.60 more per year. If you were to look at a commercial property, again, assuming that they were using 10,000 gallons between water and sewer, you would see they'd be at about $310 in 24, and then they would increase to about $326, or an increase of about $15.18. That would translate to just over $182 over the entire year. I think the nice thing to keep in mind here, when you look at the percentages between the two property types, the increase is about 6.7% for those residential ratepayers, and it's about 4.9% for commercial properties. So I think given everything that we've just reviewed, the amount of capital projects, the bonding that's required, some of the things that are beyond your control, like the MCS charges, the goal to make sure that the city has the appropriate resources in order to respond to the needs, I think that these rates and these percentages make a lot of sense, and they're generally in line with what we see for costs that cities are incurring elsewhere in the metro. So, kind of wrap it all up here, the water utility really at this point in time is looking good. The perhaps one little caveat is that you are below that working capital target in 2028, so that's just something to keep in mind, but it returns by 2029, so we generally consider the fund to be well performing. I think as we talked about, the sanitary sewer fund really is kind of, we've got the flashing yellow light. There's a little caution there that that portion of the utility does have a lower cash position than what we would like to see. It is below that target working capital, which is again that 6 months of operations plus depreciation plus debt service. And really what has to happen is there has to be some additional analysis in this area to figure out what's going on with the fund given some of those preliminary questions that we've identified around revenue projection and usage. The stormwater utility is really looking quite strong. Again, perhaps the one little caveat there is that the cash position is decreasing over time, but it's well above the working capital requirement. So there are many years of runway there. So it's just more something to keep your eye on than anything else. But really, rate increases are still needed because you need to maintain, and in some situations like sanitary sewer utility, increase those cash positions or otherwise protect them because you're susceptible to all the same costs, pressures that everyone else is susceptible to. You need to support the community needs that have been identified, at least in the first thrust, through the water treatment condition assessment. And then we do know that there's a horizontal infrastructure study, there's a fleet study. There is additionally, I know every year, kind of a relook at the organizational analysis to make sure that you have the appropriate staff. So these are all things that are going to change. And so this strategy at this point in time really helps the council from a rate perspective accomplish the needs that you've identified in the community and then can also meet your strategic vision for the organization. And of course, fund all of those various capital projects. When you look at the funds themselves, the folks that are delivering the projects are really quite busy, have a lot to do. And then really right now paying for the existing and recommended debt service. So we want to make sure that you are generating enough revenue to make good on your bond payments because of course the city is AAA rated, and if there is a very quick way to lose that AAA rating, it is to miss a bond payment or to start pulling from other funds in order to make your bond payments. So we want to make sure, we know that's very important to the council, so that's also baked into these considerations. But I don't mean to sound like I'm repeating myself here, but the one thing to keep in mind is that there are those outstanding studies, and so additional needs may result in larger increases than what we're estimating now, either because you're going to need additional cash to fund those projects or you're going to issue debt, and so you'll need to increase your rates in order to make those debt service payments. Sometimes these studies, they can be revenue neutral, or cost neutral, that does happen. But I always caution that because oftentimes, at least from our perspective at Ellers, we don't see things go down in cost. So I think the studies are a great thing. It helps you inform your long-term plan, but while we're looking at it right now, knowing that especially that horizontal infrastructure study is pending, that there could be additional costs and additional projects that are identified. So we may end up in a future year talking about kind of different expectations if the council decides to deliver more projects as a result of those studies. So a few next steps to refine the utility rate study. That includes any feedback that the council has for the presentation here tonight or, of course, any time thereafter. To revise the utility rate study as needed. And then, as I've mentioned a few times, we're really going to complete a more in-depth review of the utility rates, especially as it relates to the portion that is the sanitary sewer utility, and present them at a future council meeting. We are currently aiming for before the end of the year because the council will set the fees as you traditionally do in December when you adopt the fee schedule. So we do have some time. We've identified this issue, especially in the sanitary sewer utility fund, kind of early. And we have a few months here to do a little additional analysis and have a chat with the council about what that may mean for rates with some additional information. And this is Our recommendations, tried and true. We always say, just make sure you're reviewing the status and the activity of the utility funds annually. And this is something that we have talked about with the deputy city manager, and I know is a very high priority for her. We are also recommending that you separate the water and sanitary sewer funds into two funds. There are some challenges here when it comes to segregating the funds for the purposes of analysis and rate setting. And then, of course, since they are commingled, it is ultimately less transparent because you are funding two very large, complicated operations from a single fund. And with that, I would be happy to answer any questions.
You usually have to put one end, right?
Couldn't help myself. It's not an infographic this time, but I saw this one. It made me chuckle, so I thought it was
You and
worth
my
sharing.
grandpa would have gotten along great, Dan.
Well, I'm glad to hear that.
Any questions for Dan?
Very thorough.
Yeah, well done. I mean, well explained. And the reasons for?
That
Makes
was
sense?
clear for residents.
Huh? It makes sense?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Glad to hear
with
that.
everything that we're going through. I also like the separation of the water and sewer fund. Usually they were commingled because they always talk about if you're consuming water, it's going to have to go out.
Most of the time, yes, Madam Mayor.
At least that's how it was explained. So that's why it was a one fund, the water fund and the sewer fund, because the process is intake and output.
Madam Mayor, members of the council,
Intake and output.
certainly, to Dan's point earlier,
Yeah.
drink, drive, and flush is at the core of what we do.
Yeah, yeah.
I do think that the separation of the water
Yeah.
and sewer fund
Yeah.
provides us with a much more transparent ability to explain fluctuations in rates and where,
Yeah,
Dan, your point about these fees being pass-throughs, really
Yeah.
how that works. Also, I think it's worth repeating, we have a vulnerability assessment in all of our horizontal infrastructure that we're working through right now, which will add additional pressure particularly to sanitary sewer, but potentially beyond the water treatment plant condition assessment on the water side. I think it will help us talk about those policy decisions and priorities over the course of time as well. I would also like to compliment our finance team and our partners at Ellers. We do incredibly deep analysis every year on rates. So much like our FMP that informs your large-scale financial planning, right? Property tax levy, your budget. This analysis really does help not only us understand, but be able to effectively communicate to the community exactly what's happening and why. So I very much appreciate that. And the vision that Jenny, her team, and Ellers have brought in terms of doing this deeper dive on a rate structure analysis. We do the review every year. That analysis really will serve more like a parallel FMP on the utility rate side of things. I think that's important work for us to do.
yeah. Well, to Greg and Jenny and the entire team, I think since you took over the management position, the city manager position, every year there's been an improvement in the way that we work on the budget and the communication to our residents. And that it's very clear on all of these functions that we have here in the city, like the rate study. We used to have rate studies, but it was never explained to our citizens in the way that we're doing it now. Because usually we get the rate study, we're looking at it through the background material. There's a presentation, but it's not as thorough for our residents to really understand what it all means and why. So, thank you. I think it's well done. Any other comments, questions?
Unlike these water bottles, we have
I-
very solid financial foundation.
Careful, that's gonna follow.
I know.
Just rocking back
Okay.
and forth.
Well, if there are no other questions, and Dan, thank you for all of your analysis, and Jenny, thank you for your team and all of the great work. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Mayor, Council. Certainly, we will come back to you with
Yeah.
the results of that rate structure analysis. We'll be working on that over the next couple of months. And the separation of the funds will take a little longer. That'll probably
Yeah.
happen over the next couple of years.
Yeah.
It will be a big undertaking, but I think it will really benefit this analysis. I know Dan and his team will probably appreciate having two separate funds to analyze rather than trying to separate the one that exists now. So, and I just want to say thanks to the Public Works and
But
Finance
this is very
staff
good.
and-
It really makes for great transparency.
and
And
thanks.
accountability.
Thank you. Yep,
Yeah.
and I want to thank
Thank you.
Ellers and Finance and Public Works. We've worked really hard over the past weeks and months, so
It shows.
Thank
thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm sure Alyssa and her team also had a very significant hand in all of this too. So, thank you. Please extend our appreciation to the whole team. Yeah. Well, if there's nothing else to come before the body, there are no other items for the special budget work session. We stand adjourned by acclamation.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.